Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill Obrien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill Obrien.
Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to this Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It's an absolutely gorgeous day out. The temperature hasn't gone up too high as yet, but I know this afternoon is going to be steamy. I think they're looking for some 100-plus temperature readings in the Northeast today when you combine it with the humidity and things. So it's going to be a very, very uncomfortable afternoon, but at least where I am so far, it's fairly comfortable so far. So couple of hours of that. My wife had told me earlier, maybe you better turn on the air conditioner before it does get hot. So, but so far we're really comfortable and in good shape, and it is a pleasure to be with you on this Tuesday. I was going to be a little bit sarcastic and open the program and say, alert, alert, breaking news, the flag is still at half-mast, but I didn't do that. That's kind of a cheap shot. That's dealing with the president by stooping down to his level, and I won't. I don't want to do that. But anyway, I just couldn't, and I'm sure many of you have seen the videos. That I just could not believe the press conference in the White House yesterday when the media was badgering him about what he thought about about John McCain, and he just sat there with his arms folded like a 3-year-old and said, I'm mad, I'm mad and I'm not moving, and I'm not saying anything. And, I'm not talking to you anymore, this kind of, it was just unbelievable. But anyway, later in the evening, apparently he relented and he made some positive, I wouldn't say very positive comments, adequate comments about John McCain to a group of evangelicals that he had at the White House last night. And, made sure he still had that continued support. And he does. One of them made a comment to one of the media outlets at the end of the thing that we don't care what he does or what women he's involved in or anything else, as long as he keeps giving us the judges we need. So what can you say? But anyway, it is a beautiful day, a beautiful Tuesday, and it is a pleasure to be with you here live on the Virtual Center once again. I have been thinking about Bob and Agnes working all weekend on the technology to keep the hardware up and running for not only for this program but for his program as well. And the fact that they were able to somehow find or squeeze out or create or whatever they had to do for it, pray or whatever, they got a phone number. And so now we have a number of different ways that you can communicate directly with the studio and get on the air and share your thoughts with Agnes. I think Agnes is there today, and come on the air with us and communicate with our other listeners. I would love it. I know they would love it as well. If you are so inclined and you'd like to make a comment, because there's so many things happening, and if you listen to this program, if you listen to the Head On Radio Network, you have a pretty good idea of what's going on. And there's so many things going on that I don't believe for a moment that most of you who are out there and who happen to be listening don't have an opinion, don't have something, some thoughts about one or more of the things that are happening. If you'd like to share them with us, we'd love to hear from you. If you're a user of Skype, you can just go to Skype and type in Bob Kincaid Horn. Kincaid is Kinkaid, by the way. Bob Kincaid Horn, and that will get you into the studios, and Agnes will get you on the air immediately. If you'd like to use your phone and just call directly into the studios, you can do it that way and get on the air. And now we have 2 different numbers that you can use to do that. The number that we've had for quite some time is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. And the new number that Bob made us aware of yesterday is same area code 304 640-2829. 640-2829. If you're not comfortable about calling in and coming on the air with us, but you'd like to communicate your thoughts anyway, we have a couple of different ways you can do that. You can send me an email and express yourself or share your thoughts in that email to me, and I'll do the very best I can to get your ideas on the air. My email address, as it has been since we've been on the air, is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN, 906@gmail.com. And that's all lowercase, all one word, no punctuation. If you'd also like to communicate, you can do so on our Facebook page. If you go to Facebook and in the search bar, you'll be onto our Facebook page, and there are a number of postings there. And at the end of every posting, there are two boxes. There's a share box and a comment box. And if you click on the share box, that means that that particular posting from the Virtual Center page, Facebook page, is shared with your friends, those that you communicate with on Facebook. So if you'd like to share a particular posting on one of the issues on there with your friends, you can do that by just hitting the share button. But if you'd like to comment on that particular posting or any other issue that we've been talking about here on the air, you can do that by clicking on the comment button and just commenting on the particular issue that you have in mind. Facebook sends me a notice. In other words, when you comment on something that's on our Facebook page, I get notice that there's a comment there. And I go and check it out. And if it's related to the fact that you're listening to this program and you have a comment, I'd be more than happy to take it seriously. And if it's something that our other listeners would benefit from hearing, then I would take the liberty to sharing it with them, but doing everything I can do to give proper attribution to you. In other words, it's your thought, your comment, and you should get credit for it. There are so many things that are happening. I was thinking about yesterday's program, and I thought that we would begin today's program by going back over a few of the things that we closed yesterday's program with, and then moving on, because as I mentioned yesterday, I wanted to do something with civic education, and I also want to do something with impeachment. We've got 2 days, today and tomorrow, and I'd like to deal with both of those issues because I think they're both extremely relevant. I think the civic education issue is relevant primarily because it's so vital to what this program is about. It's not an accident that civic responsibility is part of the title of this program. Because obviously in a republic, in a popular participatory government like this one, the fact that citizens participate and the degree to which they are informed about their participation is significant. It makes the whole system go. And one of the things we've been touching on in recent weeks is the degree to which James Madison included that in his Federalist 10 document. But for some reason, and I think we've touched upon exactly what that reason is, that particular portion of Federalist number 10 never gets any traction. It's almost like it's not there. When people refer to Federalist number 10, they talk about the factionism, about the factions, about Madison's view of human nature, about his comment that factions are sewn into the nature of man, the fact that human beings, human nature is by definition self-interested, that human behavior is driven predominantly by self-interest, that it's that self-interest and the freedom that supports that self-interest that creates the challenge or the problems, as Madison calls it, the violence of faction. And in order to create a stable political system a constitutional government that will work, somehow it's necessary to regulate or control the violence of those factions without tampering or doing anything to infringe upon the liberty which is so essential to the creation of factions. As Madison says in the first part of Federalist number 10, to try to do something about factions by taking away people's freedom to belong to them would be a cure worse than the disease. So what Madison has done is put his stamp of priority approval on individual freedom. So you can't do anything to infringe upon individual freedom. What you can do is try to do something to control the results of the exercise of that individual freedom. And that's what Madison does with the Constitution of the United States. That's what he explains in the first part of Federalist number 10. And over the years, that's become the end-all, the be-all and end-all of Federalist number 10. It's almost like there's nothing else in it but that, because that's all that appears in our textbooks. That's all that our young people ever know about. And occasionally, the author of an exceptional textbook, one of the better ones, will supplement Federalist number 10 by going to other Federalist papers and pulling from them statements or individual portions which validate or support what Federalist number 10 said. Where Madison made the comment that if men were angels, we wouldn't need governments at all. But we're not dealing with angels, we're dealing with people, we're dealing with human nature. And so therefore, the need for a system where ambition is made to counter ambition in order to produce the kind of a stable society which make it difficult or impossible, hopefully, for factions to seize control and put the self-interest of those in a faction in priority status, to the point that the best interest, the public interest of all citizens, is pushed onto the back burner or is made secondary. And what we've been talking about in recent programs is the degree to which those with the power to influence what is in our textbooks, what our children are taught, what our young people are taught to believe about our political system, have been able to make sure that that particular portion of Federalist number 10 is what appears in our textbooks. And the reason for that is because, taken out of context, that particular portion of Federalist number 10 and the values or the principles upon which it's based, namely individual freedom and government's responsibility to protect private property, and many of the other things we hear so much about, all of these things constitute support for the principle of free enterprise capitalism. In other words, if you present that portion of Madison and you make it clear that that's all there is in Madison, that's what our constitutional system is about, is protecting individual freedom to pursue their own self-interest, with government's responsibility to protect whatever property or whatever success they might acquire. That's the essence of free enterprise capitalism. Consequently, it becomes very easy to make the connection and say, clearly Madison wrote the Constitution of the United States to permit the development of a system of free enterprise capitalism. But the only way you can do that is if you cherry pick Madison. If you include only the portions of Madison which fit that agenda. And if there's anything else in Madison that doesn't fit the agenda, then you don't mention it, you don't talk about it, and our young people don't even know that it's even there. Unfortunately, that's what's happened. And so what we've been talking about in recent programs is the fact that if you read the other 84 Federalist Papers, several of which, probably 16 or 17 of them, are also written by James Madison. And if you look at Madison's private letters and papers, and you look at the speeches he's given, and if you look at the discussions that occurred during the Constitutional Convention, for example, you begin to realize that there's a lot more to James Madison than just what's in that section of Federalist number 10. And that, in fact, there's so much about Madison that most of us are not privy to, are not introduced to, that we assume that that's Madison. He set up a system to deal with man the way man really is. Man is self-interested. Man is driven by a desire to be successful. And in our society, being successful more and more is associated with property, with the acquisition of wealth. Wealth translates into success. And success and wealth together translate into influence. Social influence and political influence. If that's what it's about, then no wonder the Constitution works so well, because it's written to deal with man exactly the way man really is. End of story. That's it. The problem is that in order to promote that, you have to ignore other things in Madison, not only the other Federalist Papers, but the rest of Federalist number 10 itself. Because later on in Federalist number 10, Madison lays out a very intricate system, a very intricate process for civic education, the education of citizens. Because Madison was fully aware that a republic, popular government, could only work when and if citizens participated in it. But participation itself was not enough. It had to be informed participation. Citizens had to know right from wrong. Citizens had to be able to guide government in its policy-making responsibilities to do the right thing. And in order to make sure that citizens were able to do that, they needed to be educated. And so what Madison lays out is a complicated, very complicated system of civic education based upon a series of elections, beginning at the most local level and moving from the local level to the regional level, to the state level, to the national level. And his plan was that representatives would stand for election at the lowest levels first and make their case to citizens. And citizens would be aware of the values necessary for the kind of representation they wanted. They would elect people with the qualities and the character that they felt would best represent them. And it was important for these people, for these voters, to be educated in what those qualities were. And the best way to educate them is by watching the behavior of those they sent to office. In other words, if the right kind of people stand for election and are able to move up from the lowest levels to the state, to the regional level, to the state level, and ultimately to the national level, Madison believed that that process itself would filter out self-interest totally. By the time a representative was elected to represent an entire constituency congressional district or in the Senate, even a state, that representative would know what the public interest is. He would go to the national level and sit down with other people who have gone through the same thing, and together, as statesmen whose priority is to do the best thing for the nation and its people, they would put their heads together and come up and make the best policy. And by doing that, they would educate citizens. They would show citizens the qualities and the character traits most valuable in identifying a good representative. They would serve as a lesson to voters as to the kinds of people they should vote for. And Madison believed that as that process worked over and over again, and as it operated, it would provide or serve as an educational process, not only for representatives, but for the citizens whose responsibility it was to elect them. Those are the people that Madison identified in Federalist number 10 as the best and most virtuous citizens, as the people, Madison said, who would be best able to put aside their own self-interest, whose wisdom, love of justice, and patriotism would guide them in their role as representatives. And those are the very qualities that voters would be educated to look for. That part of civic education, that part of Madison's plan, has been totally eliminated from the national conversation. We've got to do what we can do to put it back. We have got to do it because it's very obvious that our political system demands it. Our political system has run into trouble. If Madison's system had been working, let's face it. The fact that Donald Trump was able to win the presidency of the United States demonstrates that there's a major breakdown in the process of civic education in our society. Many of you in the last 24 hours have been made aware, if you're watching the media at all, and you've been watching media focus on the life and contributions of John McCain. You know that yesterday afternoon, one of John McCain's closest staff members made available a letter that McCain wanted read to the nation upon his death. And in that letter, in which he expressed his faith in the American people and his faith in the abilities of the American people to do the right thing, he acknowledged that we had problems in this society, but he trusted that the Constitution and the institutions created to support it, the threats. He had faith. And he made reference, never mentioned President Trump by name, but he made reference to the tribalism that seems to have taken over our politics, the extreme partisanship, the us and them dysfunction, which is rendering our political system dysfunctional. It threatens to bring down our entire republic. It speaks to a dangerous gap between what we call liberals and conservatives. People have gone to great lengths to try to provide a little bit more detail on what separates these two groups. A number of people have gone in the direction of cosmopolitanism versus provincialism. A number of people have focused on the nature of the populations of the United States as they have sorted themselves out. The fact that the major urban, cosmopolitan, international areas in our country are located along both coasts. That's where most of our major cities are located. That's where most, or many, if you will, not most, but many of our major universities and corporate headquarters are centered. These are the areas where large urban populations feature citizens from all over the country. These are the most pluralistic, integrated, cosmopolitan areas of our country. These are people whose vision, whose worldview is international rather than local. They see the realities of the world. They see the relationship of the United States to the rest of the world. They understand the role that the United States has assumed in leadership of that world. And they're fully aware of the responsibilities necessary to fulfill that particular role of leadership. And the fact of the matter is, for the most part, these coastal, urban, cosmopolitan areas tend to be blue. They tend to be dominated by Democrats. Hillary Clinton's strength in the 2016 election was in the number of votes she was able to garner from these urban, coastal, cosmopolitan areas. The middle of the country, which is much more rural, is also much more red. It's much more provincial, much less cosmopolitan. It's where Donald Trump's strength comes from. And there's no question that the layout of the geography, the layout of the population in this land has given Republicans an electoral college advantage because it makes the votes of smaller, less populated rural states more significant. Donald Trump was able to win the electoral college because he was able to win the electoral votes of all of these rural states between the coasts, if you will. So the nation is divided geographically as well as politically and sociologically. It's divided economically. The cost of living in many of these urban coastal areas, the major cities, New York, Boston, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, San Diego, Portland, Seattle. The cost of living is higher. Property is valued more there. Salaries are higher. Educational achievements are higher. These are less rural, less agricultural areas. The middle of the country is less industrial, less cosmopolitan, lower cost of living, lower property values, all the rest of it. And what we've been able, and if you look at it religiously, there's a religious difference between the two. Most of the most religiously fundamental people are in the middle of the country, not along the coasts. These tend to be cosmopolitan, more tolerant, more internationally focused populations. The whole point is that our nation has become divided. And the fact of the matter is, in order to function, our nation needs to be united. It is not by accident that our currency is based on the principle of a pluribus unum. From many, we've somehow got to mold this multifaceted population into a nation. We've got to bring people together. And what we've seen is we've reached a point where we have a situation, a political situation, where politics divides us rather than unites us. And we're dealing with something in politics that many of the sociologists and political scientists refer to as tribalism. Tribalism suggests a much more us versus them dichotomy, way of looking at the world. The fact of the matter is, and I have one of our listeners, Horst, in Taiwan, who put this on a Facebook message some time ago, it's his effort to more accurately describe tribalism. And what he points out is that the realities of tribalism, as we're talking about it, are very unique, because it's the international base. It's the red state base. It's President Trump's base. To view the world from a tribal perspective. But the rest of the world does not view it the same way. The rest of the nation does not view it the same way. So what we've got is a dichotomy. We have one side who looks at the situation from the perspective, it's us versus everybody else. Everybody else is out there to us, to manipulate us, to outmaneuver us. It's us against the world. We've got to hang together. And that's being reflected not only in our politics and in our conversation, but in votes on the national level as well. The rest of the nation is unaware of this tribal reality. So what you've got is a situation where one side sees a competition, the other side doesn't even know there's a competition going on. But the fact of the matter is we got a problem. And Madison knew it. And part of Madison's construction of the Constitution of the United States was a plan to educate citizens in this country as to what it was going to take from everybody, not just some, not just the majority, but everybody, to make this system work and function the way it should work. And it's broken. And that's what John McCain was referring to in the letter that he left to be read to the nation upon his death. He didn't speak to the extent to which President Trump, through his tweets and other ways, is fueling the tribalism, fueling the division, fueling the separation, fueling the dysfunction. But the fact of the matter is, John McCain expressed optimism and was very positive that eventually the system would prevail, that the citizens of the United States would make sure that our system prevailed and overcame this challenge. But the realities of the situation are that we're not there yet. I mentioned at the beginning of the program that I wanted to do something about civic education. And the reason I wanted to do something is because I know that from James Madison's perspective, this was a critical part of his plan, of his strategy. It is a part of his plan that we have chosen to ignore. We have totally overlooked. We have buried it. And it is my belief, and I don't have any evidence for this, but I would suggest that many of the people who may know it is there have made a conscious decision that as long as nobody knows it's there, we don't have to worry about it. Why do I say this? Because the fact of the matter is there's much more to James Madison. There's much more to Madison's efforts to explain and understand human nature than we've ever been informed of, that we've ever been allowed to be exposed to. James Madison was raised in Virginia. His father hired him a tutor. From the time he was 11 until the time he was 16 years old, he had a private tutor. His tutor's name was David Robinson. David Robinson was a graduate of the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. David Robinson studied under many of the leading lights of the so-called Scottish Enlightenment. David Hume, Adam Smith, Francis Hutcheson were his professors. These were the people that wrote the books that provided his college education. And when he graduated from Edinburgh, he came to the New World, came to Virginia, and was hired by James Madison Sr. as a tutor for his young son. For 6 years, from the time he was 10, between 10 and 11, up until the time he was 16 years old, James Madison's education was provided by David Robinson. And when it was time for him to begin looking for which college or university he would go to, the decision was made that it would be Princeton. Madison's father was influenced by many people with connections to Princeton. And so Madison enrolled in Princeton as a college freshman. And it just so happened that the new president of Princeton University was John Witherspoon. John Witherspoon was a minister. He was a pastor. He was a pastor who was a product of the Scottish Enlightenment as well. Douglas Adair, who wrote about Federalist number 10 and about James Madison in the middle of the 20th century, in 1951, wrote an article in the William and Mary Quarterly entitled "The 10th Federalist Revisited." And in that document, Adair pointed out that the Princeton that James Madison went to as a freshman was under the tutelage of its new president, John Witherspoon, and that John Witherspoon had done everything he could do to organize and run Princeton as a model, as a copy of what Witherspoon was familiar with from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. Witherspoon was one who had also studied with David Hume and Francis Hutcheson and Adam Smith and the rest. And he did everything he could do to organize and run Princeton the same way as what he was used to from Scotland. The library was stocked with the books of Hutcheson and Adam Smith and other leaders of the Scottish Enlightenment. Madison went through his undergraduate years at Princeton and even stayed for an additional year of study with John Witherspoon. there's absolutely no question that James Madison was a student of, a product of, the thinking of the Scottish Enlightenment. And what that meant was he didn't believe that man was totally driven by self-interest. He was aware that self-interest was a factor, but he believed that there was something more. He believed that man was born with something that the Scottish philosophers referred to as the moral sense. We talked about it in Jefferson. The continental version of the Enlightenment, the French Enlightenment, was based in large part on the philosophies associated with John Locke. When the Enlightenment went to England, the philosophies and the political thinking of John Locke became dominant. John Locke, in his essays, John Locke argued that when man was born, he was born as a blank slate, tabula rasa, that man knew nothing at birth, that everything that man ended up knowing and being and the way he acted was as a result of his environment. In other words, everything man became, everything man did, everything man believed was based on what he learned after he was born. He was born with nothing to start with. The Scottish philosophers rejected that view. They believed that man was born with certain qualities, and one of them was a conscience, what they called a moral sense. They believed that man was basically good. They didn't buy into the negative view of human nature associated with Christianity. They believed that man was born with the ability to know the difference between right and wrong. He didn't have to be taught the difference between right and wrong. He knew it innately, inherently. That was the moral sense. Madison was steeped in a philosophy based on the moral sense. He believed that man was innately and potentially good. If you put a religious connotation to it, Madison believed that there was an element of the divine in every one of us. He believed that we all had the potential to do good and be good. But he was aware that there was this constant conflict in man between his self-interest and what he knew to be right. And in his speeches and in his letters and elsewhere in the Federalist Papers, Madison spoke extensively to this more positive aspect of man's nature. At one point, Madison, in one of the Federalist Papers, made the point that if man was really as evil and self-interested as many people want to believe he is, then popular government could never work. Republicanism could never be successful. Because if self-interest was all there was, then the only way to control man would be with a strong, all-powerful government. In other words, if people's inclination was to be bad, was to be evil, if that's all they knew was get what I can get and the hell with everybody else, then Madison's point is the only way man could live together is in some sort of a dictatorship. Because if not prevented from killing other people, then there would be no organized society at all. Life would be nothing but the state of perpetual warfare, one man against all other men. You out to get everything you can get from everybody around you, and everybody around you out to get everything that they can get from you. That's the extreme of what this slanted view of human nature that so many people want to paint. That's the potential of where that was going to lead. Madison didn't believe it. Madison believed in the people. He believed in Republican government. He said in one of the Federalist papers, Republican government best defines the genius of America. The only government that can work in this society is a Republican government. And a Republican government requires that government's power not be absolute but be limited. Be limited to governing for the benefit of all the people. In other words, the public interest must always take priority over private interests. But in order for that to happen, members, people who will serve in government, have to learn that, have to be taught that. They have to go to government and assume the role of policymakers, understanding exactly what the needs of the nation as a nation are about. And they can't be driven or controlled by self-interest, by priorities, by particular interest groups, whatever. They must govern with the best interest, the common good of all the people as their number one priority. And that's why the system of civic education that Madison laid out in Federalist number 10 is so important. If you have a popular government without that, then it can't work. And James Madison, in many of his speeches, in a number of his papers, the other Federalist papers, laid out chapter and verse what he thought man was like, what human nature was about. And I've mentioned some of these things before, so I won't take a long time on them, but let me give you 4 or 5 examples. In Federalist number 55, Madison said the following: as there is a degree of depravity in mankind, so there are other qualities in human nature which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence. Unquote. What Madison is saying is, yes, there's a degree of depravity in man. Yes, there's self-interest. But there's also something else. And Madison's whole point is, if popular government's going to work, we've got to make sure that that something else dominates self-interest. And that something else is the national interest. And that's what we have to look to government to govern, to achieve, is the public interest. What's best for everybody, not just those with money, not just those with influence, not just those with power, but everybody. And in order to get people who have the proper view, the proper priorities, we've got to develop them. You can't expect people to just know it. And that's the civic education system that Madison laid out in Federalist number 10. In Federalist number 57, Madison said the following: who are to be the electors of the federal representatives? Not the rich more than the poor, not the learned more than the ignorant. The electors are to be the great body of the people, unquote. We have to trust the people to elect representatives and hold them accountable. And the only way they can do that is if they know what to look for and know what to demand from their elected representatives. And the way they know it is they learn it. And the way they learn it is by seeing it in good representatives and statesmanship. We want our young people to be inspired by John McCain, by John McCain's life, by John McCain's commitment to the nation, by John McCain's faith in the people. We want our people to look up, to respect and admire, and hopefully turn out to be as much like John McCain as we can. That's kind of what Madison is saying. When Madison spoke in Virginia at the ratifying convention making the decision on the Constitution in June of 1788, he made this statement to the convention: I go on this great Republican principle that the people will have virtue and intelligence to select men of virtue and wisdom. The whole system is based on the ability of the people to demand the qualities and character that they need from the people they elect. And the only way that people can get elected is to demonstrate those characteristics. And when the right people are elected and they behave the right way, more and more citizens will see what a good representative must be like, and they will look for it in future candidates that they will vote for. In his criticism of the Articles of Confederation, called the vices of the American political system, the vices of the Confederation, written in 1786, a month before the Constitutional Convention was scheduled to meet, Madison says at the very end, in auxiliary desideratum for melioration of the Republican form, in other words, an additional absolute requirement for Republican government, is such a process of elections as will most certainly extract from the mass of society the purest and noblest characters which it contains, such as will at once feel most strongly the proper motives to pursue the end of their appointment and be what Madison is saying, what's wrong with the Confederation, with the Articles of Confederation, is that it doesn't have the system of elections which educate both voters and elected representatives on what true statesmanship is all about. We've got to educate our young people to look for it, and we've got to educate our elected officials to deliver it. That's what must happen. And in Federalist number 10 itself, in the part that few people focus on, Madison said the following: one advantage of Republican government, he says, is to refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through a medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best discern the true interest of their country, and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. It's that refinement and enlargement of the republic of the public views, passing them through a medium of a chosen body of citizens. The chosen body of citizens are the elected representatives who have the values and the character necessary to evaluate the will of the people and do what's always in the public interest. That's statesmanship. And that's what Madison felt the system had to have in order has been eliminated, has been totally excluded from our textbooks. It's clear that there are people who don't want this idea of the moral sense included. Why? Because there's an awful lot about capitalism that isn't positive. Because capitalism tells us that the bottom line must drive all decisions. The purpose of capitalism is profit. Therefore, decisions must be made with the priority of making profit as the end goal. Whatever that might mean in terms of the way it treats people. In other words, pure capitalism suggests that you can't allow concern for people. You can't allow issues of right and wrong, morality and ethics, and all of these other things to interfere with good decisions. Decisions have to be driven by profit. Investors, stockholders look for profit. They're looking at the bottom line. If they're going to continue to invest in your company, you've got to make sure that they see profit. And you have to do whatever it takes to make that happen. In that equation, in that decision-making process, something like the moral sense can't work. It can't work. So consequently, if you want to convince people that our system works because it's based principally on people's self-interest and greed, then you got to make sure that nobody ever finds out about the moral sense. Nobody ever reads the other James Madison. And as we saw on yesterday's program, that's part and parcel of what the conservative rebound that began in the 1970s in response to Lewis Powell's Powell Memorandum is all about. Corporate America became aggressive. Corporate America organized. Corporate America took the bull by the horns and began to counter the challenges to capitalism, to the inhumanity, to the inequality, to the lack of concern about people that was going on in the society. And where government was demanding as a continuation of the New Deal before World War II, after World War II, the nation continued to demand that government regulate the behavior of corporations, regulate their activities, make sure that the needs of citizens were considered, that workers were treated fairly, that they received a living wage, that they lived honorably, that they were paid what was necessary to raise families and raise their children and live good quality lives. Corporations had that responsibility, and it was up to government to make sure they did it, that they lived up to it. It's against that Lewis Powell wrote his memorandum. If the United States Senate had known about the existence of that memorandum, Lewis Powell would never have been confirmed for the Supreme Court of the United States. But what happened, I know we're going over because we're at the top of the hour, but let me at least finish this thought so we can kind of put this once and for all to rest. What is included in Lewis Powell's memorandum, his manifesto? Well, we talked the other day about the fact that he wanted what was taught on college campuses to be countered with a pro-business, pro-capitalism approach. He wanted those people with power and influence to edit our textbooks, to make sure that we knew and we were aware of what was being taught to our young people. We covered all of that. But there's more. As a reaction to Powell's memorandum and government's response, business's response, things began to happen. In 1972, the National Association of Manufacturers moved its offices to Washington so it could better lobby government. In 1968, 50 companies had public affairs offices in Washington. By 1978, 500 companies had lobbyists, had offices, PR offices in Washington, D.C. A 500% increase. In 1971, 175 companies had paid lobbyists in Washington. 7 years later, in 1982, 2,500 companies had paid lobbyists in Washington. Corporate PACs, political action committees, increased from 300 in 1976 to 1,200 in 1980. 1,200 corporate political action committees. Between 1974 and 1980, in 6 years, the membership of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce doubled, its budget tripled. Business was on the march. Business was engaged in a counteroffensive against liberalism. Business became more proficient in communications, in advertising, in organizing constituents to call their representatives, writing letters to congressmen and senators, and all the rest. In 1972, the Business Roundtable was founded, which was comprised only of corporate CEOs. It began up. Let me get my numbers accurately. The Business Roundtable ended up with, I believe, I can't remember the percentage of the 200 top corporations in the country were parts of the Business Roundtable. Whereas business used to divide its money between Democratic candidates and Republican candidates. In other words, business wanted to have influence over government, whichever party was in control. During the late 70s and early 80s, business began to put more and more money into Republican campaigns, less and less into Democratic campaigns. In the off-year elections of 1978, up to that election, corporate money between Democrats and Republicans had approximately been on the 50-50 in terms of its division. In the off-year elections of 1978, 71% of corporate money went to Republicans, only 29% went to Democrats. All of this speaks to the power and the growing influence of corporations in American politics. And we've seen the results. It's in order to counter this that moderate Republicans and Democrats got together and began to enact corporate campaign legislation like McCain-Feingold, which we talked about yesterday. And now the Supreme Court is overturning and has overturned corporate finance legislation by pointing to the extent to which corporate contributions are protected under the First Amendment rights to free speech. The right of corporations to contribute to political campaigns is, says Citizens United, a free speech right under the First Amendment. So in a sense, what we've seen is the ebb and flow of liberalism in response to Watergate, followed by the conservative response driven by the Powell Memorandum, and that conservative response continues to go on as corporate money and foundation money is controlling our business schools, our graduate schools of business on our major campuses. And now it is increasingly controlling the Supreme Court and all of that. And the American public is standing back and unsure as to what's going on and what the alternatives are. Civic education, as we've known the term, is not even visible. It's got to be. It's got to be. It is 5 minutes after the hour. We're going to pause and take a break and give everybody a chance to all of that, to kind of relax. We'll be right back after a 5-minute break. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. And what the alternatives are. Civic education, as we've known the term, is not even visible. It's got to be. It's got to be. It's 5 minutes after the hour. We're going to pause and take a break and give everybody a chance to kind of relax. Right back after a 5-minute break. Please stay with us. Right back.
return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here's your host, Dr. Bill Obrien. Bill?
In today's...
That's wonderful. Today is awesome.
Oh, well, I don't know. I'm kind of sweating. I was talking about how it was going to be hot this afternoon, but it was still pretty comfortable here, and now I'm dying.
Oh, no. Well,
so,
it could be you got really worked up, but this is a powerful message.
I did. Oh, it's frightening. And unfortunately, it really is. Because what we're dealing with a move that is so powerful and so well funded that it's going to be very difficult to counter it. What we've done instead is we've come up with what I think is a rather bland, ineffective approach to civic education and look to our schools to do it. And for a number of reasons, they're not doing it. I thought I'd get a little bit into that this hour.
Well, you're right on spot.
It's obviously nowhere near what the system requires, which is the system as Madison designed it.
No, and some schools don't have civics anymore.
No, they've done that. Now, according to this, the research says that every state has some sort of a civic education requirement. But the fact of the matter is some of them only have like a quarter of a year or half of a year at the most of requirement that in existing courses some attention must be paid to civic education. But it's kind of like an afterthought. It doesn't take, nothing happens.
And but you mentioned something very specific earlier. It's the rewriting of textbooks also.
Oh yeah, the rewriting of textbooks is the key. You got to make sure that none of this stuff that raises questions gets into the books.
But they do.
And it's notorious about the way that publishers are required to edit textbooks and to make sure that all the most inflammatory stuff that's in them is taken out. And so what we're giving our young people as textbooks is a very bland treatment of the particular subject matter. And we expect them to get excited about it and learn. I mean, if you think about it, it's unbelievable. I mean, it explains so many of the things that are wrong with our schools and the way we treat our teachers. It's an impossible task we ask them to do.
Very true. And, it's like you said, one's tapioca and one's meat and potatoes. And if you don't have the meat and potatoes, then you don't have a very strong base.
No, you don't have much energy if all it's fueling it is tapioca.
Exactly. I'll let you get back. You're welcome.
Thank you, Agnes. I appreciate that so much. Welcome to our second hour. If you do have comments and you would like to comment, first of all, I would love to hear from you. If nothing else, I could sit there and listen to you for a bit. But seriously, we would love to hear from you, and I know our other listeners as well. This is pretty controversial stuff. I'll be honest with you. and there's an upside and a downside here to what I'm going to say. The downside is, God, I wished I'd known this stuff 30 years ago. And I could have done so much in my teaching in my years in professional education if I had known a lot of this stuff at the time. I could have done something about it. The upside of this is that it's only because of this program and preparing for this program that I've been driven to get into some of this. When you're teaching full time, honestly, I was telling you last year about my class where last year I had more than 80 students in it. When you're responsible for teaching a class that size, and you have, if you're teaching full time, you have 4 of them. That's 400 students. So most full-time faculty members now at colleges and universities are responsible for anywhere from 200 to 400 students a semester. And the point I'm trying to make is you don't have time to get into a lot of these things. I mean, basically what your time is spent on is going with what you already have. And what you already have is the product, for the most part, of survey classes, which means you're only getting skimming the top or touching the bases, if you will. You're not getting into the kind of depth you would need to get in order to get into these kind of issues. Basically, what I'm talking about is much of what you have to teach comes from textbooks. And so when you begin to put it all together, you can begin to see how this works or hasn't worked, depending on how you look at it. And because of this program, and because I wanted to go beyond textbooks and get in to some of the real depth in some of these things, I've forced myself to get into areas that I never had time to get into before. And what I'm learning is astounding me. But I'm doing, as I said, I'm trying to do the very best I can, and I hope and I trust that you understand that. We would love to hear from you. As I've mentioned, we have a number of ways that you can communicate with us. On Skype, you can type in Bob Kincaid Skype on your Bob Kincaid Horn on your computer on Skype, and that'll get you directly into our studios, and Agnes will get you on the air. Or you can use either one of two numbers that we have that you can call and get directly into our studios. The one that we traditionally had, we still do, area code 304-574-8178. The new one, area code 304-640-2829. Either one of those will get you into the studios, and Agnes will get you on the air. Or you can put your thoughts down in an email and send them directly to me via email at waobrien906@gmail.com. Or you can go to our Facebook page, click on one of the comment buttons after one of the postings on our Facebook page, and basically express yourself that way to me. And I'd be glad to get your thoughts or your ideas on the air. I'm going to make an effort, and I probably won't have time to do it between now and tomorrow's program. But once tomorrow's program is completed, I'm going to get into the latter part of the week and into the weekend. I plan to try to get some of this on Facebook. I really believe that any one of these issues by themselves is kind of interesting. But it's only when you pull them all together that they become meaningful. I mean, if you read about the elements of the 70s, and you saw it proposed and laid out, the game plan laid out by Lewis Powell in his August 1971 memorandum to the director of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Eugene Sidner, who's a neighbor and friend of Lewis Powell. Then you can make the connection and say, oh, Powell recommended these things. Look what happened. And look what's still continuing to happen with Supreme Court appointments, with lobbyists, with the influence of campaign money in our elections, with the power and influence of the Koch Foundation, the extent to which the Koch Foundation has been able to buy influence in our major colleges and universities in the country. And as I mentioned yesterday, the data tells us, you can go online for this, this is where I got it, that the Koch Foundation directly funds 300 business programs at colleges and universities around this country. And many of them, some of the biggest ones. And of course, the one we focused on most here is George Mason University in Washington, D.C. But we did a little bit with Arizona State University. There are a number of others, North Carolina State. And as I mentioned, one of them is the business program here at West Virginia University. I know a few of the people who are associated with the business program at WVU at West Virginia University. They're good people. They know that much of their funding is coming from the Koch Foundation. But I don't think they would sit down over a beer and admit that because of the Koch funding, they're doing or not doing certain things. In other words, their argument is, wherever the money comes from, I don't care. At least it keeps me employed. It keeps me working. But I think it's important to realize that there's more to it than that, because Koch's or any other foundation is not going to provide this kind of big money without some sort of a payback. Clearly, there are strings attached. And there's one, as long as I'm there, there's one more point to make about that, which I don't think we can ever allow ourselves to overlook or forget. And that is the degree to which our colleges and universities have been rendered totally dependent on private funding. State support, taxpayer support for public education and higher education in this country in recent years has plummeted. Let me share with you an observation. As Republicans have continued to take over more and more of our state governments, governorships, legislatures, etc., Republicans' emphasis on balanced budgets, Republican emphasis on reducing the size and the cost of governments has resulted in the proportion of taxpayer support for higher education going down and down and down. Public institutions receive less and less every year from the states that fund them. Consequently, in order to maintain the viability of their educational programs, colleges and universities have had no option but to raise tuition. And they've continued to raise it and raise it and raise it to the point that many students are graduating with an impossible debt load. Even if they qualify for financial aid, even if they go in there, begin college as one of the most needy students who is eligible for all sorts of federal financial aid to the maximum level, tuition costs have gone so far beyond what financial aid will cover that students have increasingly had to borrow money in order to supplement their financial aid. Many of them have been required to take jobs in addition to going to school, because everything they have is going into paying the cost of their education, and they have to work in order to generate cash to live on, money to live on. And the result of that, if you think about it, is that many people don't graduate in 4 years or 5 years or even 6 years, because so many people are being required to work as well as go to school. It means they're in school longer, which means that it takes them more years, more semesters to graduate, which means they're paying more in tuition because they're not getting out as quick as they could if their financial aid covered everything and they didn't have to work. So it's kind of a catch-22 situation. As tuition continues to go up and students struggle to pay it, they're not graduating as fast as they could. Consequently, it's costing them more. Consequently, they're incurring even more debt than they would if they could just go in, take the classes, and graduate. And the reason for this is that these Republican-controlled state legislatures are whacking away at the degree of support for public and higher education that legislatures provide, which means that they are turning our private colleges, not private only, public as well, colleges and universities into a desperate search for money. And so along come the Koch Foundation or the foundations, and they're willing to make these huge grants to colleges and universities if they can exercise some of the control over who's hired and what's taught. And when you put it all together, that's having an impact on what our students learn, what majors they go in, and what life objectives they graduate wanting to achieve. When you think about it, it's almost insidious. It almost sounds conspiratorial, doesn't it? But it's making one logical decision on top of a previous logical decision. And it's taking us in directions as we look back that we probably didn't want to go in the first place. I've done some research on civic education, and I think Agnes and I chatted a little bit about some states who don't have it. And this is a piece put together by Paul Baumann, who is putting this together on behalf of the Education Commission of the states. This is a multi-state, nationwide, national effort to identify, to define civic education, and to break it down into what quality civic education must consist of. And Baumann says that the most frequent question he's constantly answering from people is just exactly what is civic education? Well, the National Council for Social Studies defines civic education this way, and this is a quote: "In a constitutional democracy, productive civic engagement requires knowledge of the history, principles, and foundations of our American democracy, and the ability to participate in civic and democratic processes. People demonstrate civic engagement when they address public problems, both individually and collaboratively, and when they maintain, strengthen, and improve communities and societies. Thus, civics is in part the study of how people participate in governing society," unquote. If you think about that definition of civic education, it's basically 5 long lines which don't say too much more than most of us already knew. It's understanding the details, the ingredients of our system, but also becoming involved in participating in that system. Civic education, according to the campaign for the civic mission of our schools, lists competencies, and this is what our modern education system deals with, are competencies. In other words, these are the things that we want students to know and be able to do after they've experienced the particular class that we're talking about. And they divide these competencies into 4 different groups: civic content education, civic skills, both intellectual and participatory, and civic dispositions. 4 areas. Let me explain them in another way. What young people know, how they perform, and what their attitudes are, their dispositions. In other words, their behavioral priorities or characteristics. I'm going to go through these very quickly because you'll go to sleep if I spend that much time on these things. So let me just run through quickly. Most of these things you've probably heard of or seen before. Under content, in other words, what is civic education? What knowledge are we expecting young people to confront, to deal with in getting a civic education? Well, first is key historical periods, episodes, cases, themes, and experiences of individuals and groups in United States history. In other words, becoming fully familiar with American history and the role that civic education, interaction between citizen and government, plays in that history. Principles, documents, ideas essential to constitutional democracy. the relationship between historical documents, principles, and episodes and contemporary issues today, mechanisms and structures of the U.S. legal system, the relationships between government and other sectors of society, our political and civic heroes, social and political networks available for making change, social movements and struggles. In other words, the story of civil rights, of women's rights, of student rights in the development of our country. That's the knowledge that we expect our young people to have. In terms of the skills, what we expect our people to be able to do in order to function as good citizens in this society, these skills are divided into two categories: intellectual and participatory. The intellectual skills: critical thinking, perspective taking, understanding, interpreting, and critiquing media, understanding and critiquing different points of view, expressing one's opinion, listening to the opinions of others, identifying public problems, and drawing connections between democratic concepts and principles and one's own life experiences. In other words, the intellectual skills are how you apply what you've learned. Now the part of the skills that deals with participation, engaging in dialogue with those who hold different points of view, listening actively to others with different points of view, communicating through public speaking, letter writing, petitioning, canvassing, lobbying, organizing, participating in groups, utilizing electoral processes, voting for change, planning and running meetings, utilizing strategic networks, all of these mechanisms available to us in order to participate in our society. And finally, civic dispositions. What do we want our people to value in terms of attitudes and behaviors? What does that mean? Here's a list: tolerance and respect for others, appreciation of differences, rejection of violence, concern for the rights and welfare of other people, commitment to balancing personal freedom with social responsibility, the idea of belonging to a group or a political constituency, desire for readily involving oneself in the community, paying attention to civic matters, the news, in other words, knowing what's going on, being informed. That's the essence of what civic education is supposed to produce. Let's be honest. It ain't working. I would suggest to you that if you think of all of those terms, all of those categories that I just shared with you, and I went online and went through looked at a number of websites on civic education before I put that together, it's pretty obvious that there's a huge gap between what civic education is comprised of and what our students take away from it. Let's be blunt. Our students are leaving school knowing none of this stuff. Our students' ignorance of the way our government functions, of the history of our government, the history of our country, is immense. There's research coming out all the time demonstrating how little our young people know about their country, their government, the priorities of their government, the priorities of society, and all the rest of it. We are turning out students who are becoming ignorant participators in our political system. They aren't informed citizens. They are the exact opposite of informed citizens. And because they aren't informed, because they aren't educated, because they don't know what to look for, that means that they are vulnerable to being persuaded, to being conned, to being manipulated by prominent political leaders, by powerful groups. In other words, our citizens are vulnerable and open to manipulation because they don't know enough to recognize it and or resist it. We're dealing with it all the time when we talk about truth, when we talk about what's true and what isn't true, when we talk about hypocrisy, when we talk about contradictions. There's so much evidence that you can pull together to make a point on any of these things that it's incredible. But the fact of the matter is, insight, research, all of those things are getting us nowhere because people have developed the habit of only listening to the people that tell them what they want to hear. People who apparently believe what they believe. This person thinks the same way I do. This person wants the same things I want. Therefore, I'll vote for him or her, or I'll surrender my power to that person to represent me in whatever it is. And the reality is that it's very easy for these groups of people to find out exactly what you want and what you believe. Let's be blunt. We know that you're ignorant. We know what you know and what you don't know. We know what you know because we put it there. And we insisted that the state hire teachers whose job is to teach you what we want you to know. What we want. In 1786, Benjamin Rush called it creating little Republican machines. Today, we're not calling it little Republican machines. Today, we're calling it little people who are willing to support government because government has the jobs, and if you're going to make it in this life, you better damn well do what we say and vote the way we want you to vote. That seems to be the bottom line we're dealing with here. We better do something about this stuff. I mean, all of this yesterday and today and all of the stuff we're talking about. I mean, it may sound good if I was anywhere near successful and made it sound persuasive and powerful enough. Basically, what I'm saying is if it's that powerful, what I'm saying is, there it is, folks. How do we deal with it? Because we got to deal with it. It's not enough just to know it. In fact, it's counterproductive to know it and then throw up your hands and say there's nothing we can do about it. Is the optimism of John McCain totally misplaced? Is his faith in the American people misplaced? Is Madison's trust in the ability of the American people to govern themselves misplaced? Are the cynics right? The only way to have a stable, peaceful society is to turn power over to dictators? As long as they're brutalizing other people and not us, no problem. As long as we have a government that will use its power to protect us by brutalizing others, we're good. No, we're not. No, we're not. because there at some point will come a time when they'll come for us. And there won't be anybody to support us because we didn't support them. Before we finish today's program, actually, we got almost 20 minutes left in today's program. This won't take that long, but I was reading an article yesterday in the New Yorker magazine by George Packer, and I don't know how many of you have seen before some of the things that George Packer has written. He's one of the best commentators that I've seen. The New Yorker employs nothing but superb writers and columnists, and George Packer is one. Anyway, in the latest New Yorker, which just came out, I just got it in the mail yesterday. The publication date is August 27th. Today's the 28th. How's that? I just got this yesterday in the mail. George Packer is writing about the recession of 10 years ago, the recession of 08, which many of us, all of us, will remember. And now it's 10 years. And what Packer is trying to tell us is, where have we come in those 10 years? What's happened in respect to the recession of 2008? It's a brief but superb summary of what caused it, what we did to try to combat it, and what the outcome is. I want to share a couple of things with you. Most of it is familiar. Some of it isn't, at least to me. And Packer makes this point so well. This one hit me hard. He's talking about the recession. He said, in just a few days in September 2008, Lehman Brothers ceased to exist. The Federal Reserve took over AIG, the American International Group, to prevent an even wider collapse. Commercial banks and mortgage lenders around the country began to fail. And that was the recession. It appeared, Packer says, that Citigroup was going to go down next. Citigroup, along with General Motors and Chrysler. The fact is that it happened fast, but Packer said it took years to emerge. The recession was caused, Packer says, by reckless lending practices, Wall Street greed, outright fraud, lax government oversight in the George W. Bush years, deregulation of the financial sector in the Bill Clinton years. The deepest source of all, however, he says, was rising inequality. In good times and bad times, it didn't seem to matter which party was in power. The middle class was being squeezed and driven further and further into debt. And it all came to a head in 2008, when many homeowners learned their most valuable and tangible asset, the home they lived in, had become tangled up in obscure entities called derivatives, mortgage-backed securities, collateralized debt obligations. Your home mortgage became part of a loan that somebody held, maybe in Japan. That's how bad it came. When the crash came, it wiped out, this is amazing data, it wiped out 9 million jobs, took away 9 million homes, erased retirement accounts, pushed large numbers of Americans out of the middle class. And the reality is, most of those folks never recovered. The economy recovered. The economy began to generate wealth again, but it didn't go back to the people who lost it. They were permanently wiped out. At first, Packer says, American institutions responded with signs of health. The Federal Reserve stopped the free fall of the biggest banks. The press uncovered corruption and fraud. Congress passed legislation to get credit flowing and to rescue the financial sector. In other words, it looked like government was ready to respond in a way that would probably put the brakes on this recession. And then the election of 2008 came. Barack Obama was elected. The financial crisis decided the election of 2008. And the party that was in power when the crisis began to develop was knocked out of power, replaced by Obama and the Democrats. Within 3 weeks of President Obama's inauguration, February 2009, Congress passed a stimulus bill, nearly $1 trillion in tax cuts, aid to states, infrastructure spending. All of these considered essential by economists of every persuasion, conservatives, liberals, it didn't matter. Government had to do something in order to bring the recession to a halt and begin the rebound. When this stimulus package, this $1 trillion stimulus package, came to Congress, only 3 Republicans voted for it. Not one member of the House of Representatives voted for it. Republicans led by Mitch McConnell chose to oppose every Democratic measure, including reform of Wall Street. In doing that, they impeded the recovery and let the Democrats take the fall. Packer calls it a brilliantly immoral strategy that worked. The reason that Obama was unable to reverse the negatives of the recession, in large part, was because of Republican obstruction in Congress. All of us remember Mitch McConnell standing up and saying his number one priority is to make sure that Obama was a one-term president, and that if he had anything to that Obama proposed. And what that meant was that they disarmed the president and the government as it tried to meet the dangers of the recession, which meant more people were wiped out and fewer people were able to recover. Packer says the stimulus package should have been much larger, with more money for job creation. More indebted homeowners could have been kept in their homes. Maybe Obama made too many compromises because he was appealing to bipartisanship. He was hoping that the Republicans would work with him to stem the recession. But Packer says Obama's biggest mistake was not only to save the banks, but to save the bankers as well. Not one person went to jail, when in fact they caused it. Out of this came both the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street. Each side began to take extreme action. The fact of the matter is, we continue to deal with the results of that reality. Republicans now control all facets of the government. They were about to undo Dodd-Frank and the regulatory reforms over Wall Street that were passed. Packer says they're putting us back into the same financial situation that we were in prior to 2008. Nothing happened to the people that caused it, so in effect they were given a blank check to do the same kinds of things, and the likely result is the same results are going to happen. The only thing that Packer closes with is, this time we're not going to be as ready to deal with it as we were in 2008. If we have another one, it's going to be worse, and the recovery is going to take longer and be more painful. I thought that was a powerful article. It's short. Many of the articles in the New Yorker run 4 and 5 pages long. This ran just about 1 page. I thought it was pretty powerful and pretty effective. Finally, and we've probably got 5 or 6 minutes left in our program today, I wanted to acquaint you with one other thing that I came across in my reading. This, I think I mentioned this before. This particular article I've been carrying around for a while. It's dated August 15th. Today's the 28th, so this is almost 2 weeks. This is 2 weeks old. But a book entitled The Greatest Intelligence Operation of Our Time was written by an author named Craig Unger. Craig Unger was interviewed on television, and in his research, he made the statement that Trump Tower became a cathedral of money laundering. The title of his book is, quote, The House of Putin, the House of Trump. And in that book, Unger says that the president was compromised by Russian intelligence 30 years ago, and that Russian mobsters, the Russian underground, if you will, organized crime in Russia, is directly responsible for the Trump real estate empire. This is a quote from his book. Unger says, I go back nearly 40 years, and I see essentially the greatest intelligence operations of our time. It started off in 1984 with a man who had ties to the Russian mafia, who met with Donald Trump at Trump Tower. This was the supreme moment of Donald Trump becoming master of real estate in the United States. And what we end up seeing is Trump Tower become sort of a cathedral of money laundering, unquote. That mob associate paid $6 million in cash for 5 condominiums. Unger tracked hundreds of similar transactions over the following 30 years. And this is what he says in his book. That sets off a pattern that goes on for the next 30 years or so, in which over 1,300 condos are sold in what appears to be money laundering, Unger wrote. These deals have 2 characteristics. One, they are all in cash, all 1,300 of them. And second, they are shell purchases, anonymous purchases. The records don't show who owns these condos. They're dummy companies. Consequently, the House of Putin, the House of Trump, that since 1984, Donald Trump's real estate empire has been driven by Russian collusion. It has been driven by seemingly unlimited sources of Russian cash coming into the United States to buy condos, 1,300 of them over 30 years, all of them paid for in cash, none of them listing legitimate owners. Consequently, Unger says, you can't come to any conclusion other than that this is a giant money laundering scheme. Underworld money is being funneled from Russian gangsters into the United States through Trump Tower, is what Unger concludes. I have no basis on which to know whether Unger's research is valid, accurate, or anything else. What I do know is I saw him interviewed on television, and then later on, a couple of days later, I picked up this article which kind of reviewed his statements while he was being interviewed and a number of quotes from his book. And I copied that particular document, and I've been carrying it around for a couple of weeks on the assumption that I would share it with everybody here at the Virtual Center. I think it's interesting because it fits into the whole Mueller investigation and all the rest of it. I will say one thing, and this is the reason, because usually when I find something like this, I try to go back online and do some backup research in order to back up or validate the conclusions that the person writing this has made before I share them with you. I don't want to become an instrument in conspiracy theories and all the rest of it. In other words, if this particular study is bogus, then I want to know it before I share it with you. The one thing that I can say about this particular conclusion, this particular study, is that whatever there is to it, the Mueller investigation has got. And I can pretty much conclude that even if I don't do the backup research to validate the conclusions that Unger has reached, Robert Mueller's people will. If there's nothing to it, then there'll be nothing to it. But if there's something to it, Mueller's going to find out about it, and we're going to hear about it. That I'm reminded of statements here, there, and everywhere that tend to validate some of this. The statement made several years ago by President Trump's son, Eric, that significant amounts of Trump money were coming from Russia. Cash. The fact that so much of what the Trump people did was done in cash. I think all of it validates some of the conclusions that Unger reaches in his book. The one thing I think I've concluded, and we're right almost at the end. We've only got a minute left. But one of the conclusions I've reached as we do this is when Trump leaves office, when the Trump presidency is over, there's going to be more. This is going to be a field day for historians in the future. There are going to be more books and more studies about this administration than probably any that the nation has ever seen before. There's so much going on that everybody can only speculate about because it's all behind closed doors. And let me leave you today with the image, the video image of President Trump sitting in his office with his arms folded while the media screams at him, "Mr. President, do you believe that John McCain is a hero?" On that note, maybe that's a good way to say goodbye for today. We've reached the top of the hour. It's right at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. I want to thank you for your continued support of this program and your support of Bob and Agnes and the folks at the Head On Radio Network. I ask you to continue as much as you can to support the efforts of this group. I invite you to invite your friends to join us. Share. All the programs are archived. They're all available online, whiterosesociety.org or YouTube. If you go to YouTube, you can find audio broadcasts of most of the programs that we've done for the last several years. So for these folks at Head On, let me bid you a good day. I hope you have a wonderful evening. And all things willing, Lord willing, we'll be back together again tomorrow here at the Virtual Center. Thank you so very, very much. You have no idea how much I appreciate you. Thank you.